Now, I want to preface today's lecture by saying that regrettably, this is far and away the hardest and densest, the worst lecture of the course, because it presupposes that you're already at home with all the schools, in all the categories, in all the periods. And then I jump back and forth to try to put it all together into a progression. This definitely should be read slowly, and then hold out that sheet that you have, Western History in Dim Terms, page 13. Try to get the general idea, and I promise you the next 3 lectures will all be on what is America like today, and I think you'll have less trouble, much less trouble, than today. But I can't do them until I do this, because this is my framework for explaining what's going on today. Today we're going to look at the whole of Western history, at the whole progression of modes, and try to understand why they change as they did. And if so, does that imply something about how they will change from today into the future? I'm only going to cover the period up to the beginning of modernism. That is, through early mid-19th century. I'm saving our era, the modern era, which I define as 1852 to present, for the next 3 lectures. Now, the first thing to say about the progression of modes is that I'm not a follower of Hegel. This is not like a ballet or dance of abstract entities developing independently of worldly events, governed by some dialectic or other rationalist logic. On the contrary, a mode is a method of thinking, and method requires content. If your thinking is non-Platonic, you're thinking about something, about particulars. So the rise and fall of any mode can be understood only in conjunction with a particular event or set of events. An event or set of events which, in the context of the period, leads people to conclude that the established mode, when I say established, it's always capital E, the establishment, that the established mode, this event leads them to think the established mode is no good, unsafe, backward, invalid, even evil. And so the result, other things being equal, is a modal changeover. So a mode by itself is not a cause of change. It requires what I call a trigger, a triggering event or series of events. But that trigger by itself is not the cause of change. The cause is the two together. And of course, there's one other condition for there to be a change. The society has to know of another possibility, another alternative mode that's either known and approved by the intellectuals or by an aroused public, even if they're not intellectuals. And we'll see all these variations. Now, there's no, judging by history, which is all I've got to go on as a factual basis, there is no delimitation of what kind of events can serve as trigger. In actual history, they've run the gamut of the imaginable and even inconceivable. Sometimes a mode has changed over because of a purely intellectual event, like the appearance of a new philosophy. Sometimes because of socioeconomic development. Sometimes moral revulsion against the society's leadership, even if the people don't know philosophy. Sometimes a society capitulates by brute force and has a mode forced on them. Military conquest being the arch example of that. There's many, many possible type of factors. Sometimes, given the nature of a factor, you can date it. It happened with the Peloponnesian War. It happened with the 1929 Depression. Sometimes it's a condition or set of conditions that are not dateable. They begin and they get stronger and more intense until they're unbearable. The trigger is a particular occurrence or set which prompts a society or its leaders at some point to say, we can't take it, we don't want it, something new is required. Now, I just want to add that there is no necessary correlation between the historical prominence of an event and a trigger. There can be very, very important events which have no effect on changing mode. For instance, the revolt of the Lutherans against the Catholics had resounding effects on the Catholic Church, but not on the M2 mode, because the Lutherans were just as M2 as the Catholics were. So it was just an exchange of power from one M2 group to another. That was not a modal change. Now, do I believe that modal theory is able to predict the rise or growth of disaffection in a society? Can I tell you in advance the concretes that will trigger the demise? Absolutely no. I am not a seer. I have no insight of that kind. There's no way philosophy can tell you that. But the question that the dim theory attempts to answer is only this, but it's a nice question. Given the establishment mode, and that you can only know, as we've seen, by studying the cultural works and abstracting. Given the known established mode, and given a bunch of obviously potentially precipitating concretes, what new mode will people choose to embrace? Given, in other words, profound dissatisfaction, and given where we are, where will people go? And that's what I claim. Now let me just repeat what I said in answer to a question. This has not implied determinism. We are not puppets of the dominant philosophy or the mode. When these critical triggers take place, it remains possible for people to decide consciously to evaluate them differently than the standard way, and even to do so rationally. So Ayn Rand's formulation that man has the choice to think or not to think remains untouched. There is no mode and no crisis of action that can necessitate a man to give up reason or refuse to think. No modal change, like no act of human beings, is inevitable. But, and this is the crucial but, the volitional does not mean the whim, the acausal, the inexplicable. Free will is real, but it's not omnipotent. You cannot change, a society cannot change modes or philosophies by whim, wish, or desire. And in many cases where they simply can't change the mode. For instance, they don't know of another appealing philosophy or mode. In others, a mode has been unpopular, hugely unpopular, but the dissenters, for various reasons, cannot arouse enough opposition to shake the establishment. In still others, the establishment is so powerful intellectual, as it seems to the people at the time. They have so impressive an ability to defend their view that opponents give up the very attempt that they can't answer firepower of that strength. Now that's the type of cases where people may not like the way things are, but it's not going to change. In the other direction, there are cases in which modal changeover is inevitable. Some it can't happen, some it must happen. And that's independent of free will. It doesn't make any difference what you do with your free will, because at a certain point, what they call a point of no return is reached. And when you reach that point, you can't stop it. That's by definition. You know, according to the old metaphor, you're free to jump from the roof of a skyscraper, but that's it. Thereafter, logic and nature take over no matter what you want. Now, another preliminary here is very difficult and time-consuming for a society to change its mode of thinking. Because during these transitions from one to the other, most men have to rely on their traditional, established methods while learning how to criticize and replace it. They have nothing else to use. So you'll find usually between one mode's rule and another a period of cultural indeterminacy where people flounder mentally. They're attracted to contradictory fragments of the old, and at the same time, they're fascinated. They feel relieved by the elements of the new. The establishment pulls them one way, and the new rebels pull them another. And so the society as a whole at this stage has no firm policy of integration. But so far, and I don't say this is inevitable forever, so far, thanks to the Greeks, the need of philosophy has been so embedded in the Western mind that however indeterminate and confused, Westerners never threw up their mind and said, well, to hell, we won't have any way of functioning. It just will be wherever it is. They've always pursued and eventually found, from the time of the Greeks to today, and never been able to function without a definite mode. Now, sometimes to go from one to the other is very fast, a decade. But mostly this kind of mental reorientation takes at least a generation, and sometimes much longer. And you only tell the length by observation. The new one begins when the modal consistency appears, when everything that's characteristic is now there. Now I'm giving you dates, if you look at that, for the six intervals, six eras that I covered. And obviously, no culture starts or ends on a particular day. These figures have to be extremely generalized. Any particular date, such as I'm giving, is just arbitrary, flat out arbitrary. I am giving dates simply because I do not take them literally, and you shouldn't either. I reach these figures like 14 to 16 or 19, etc., by taking a rough average from a few reputable scholars of what is the generally recognized lifespan, and then rounded the figures for convenience and thrown in a part of the transition in each side. So the dates that I offer could be mistaken by 50 years at least, or in regard to long-lived cultures, even by multiples of that. But that's unimportant to this discussion because I don't need and don't use the exact dates. I want merely to determine at a certain point the magnitude by which certain modes relate to others. So it doesn't make any difference if I'm off 50, 100 years even. You can see the whole progression of dates as I picked them from the chart. Now I want to go through history, the modal rises and falls, and try to understand the strength and weakness of each mode, its ability to thrive and its vulnerability, either to inner decay or outer assault. Now, I'm not doing the Kantian part because that didn't exist through the early 19th century. Each of the modes, you will note if you look on the far right, appears twice There's two I's, two M1s, and two M2s, one before and one after in the modern world. And in order to study these properly, the inner nature and consequences of a mode, I'm taking the two I's, then the two M1s, and the two M2s. So we're starting with classical Greece. And you've already had a presentation. I want to now see what we can learn if we find another I, and if we're ever to have another I. We know nothing about the cause of this first rise of the I mode, simply that it was an I culture and that it has been the most philosophical in Western history. Aristotle, as we know, expressed its fundamental ideas. Now, the whole Greek culture, they were the men who gave birth to philosophy. And from that fact, you can see that they could hardly solve all its problems. Unavoidably, there were many gaps and errors in the thought of these pioneers groping to a hitherto unknown field. The greatest philosophic gaps, as we look back, are in two technical but urgent issues in regard to a philosophy: concepts and values. Even Aristotle, much as he tried and did claim that concepts are abstracted from percepts, couldn't define the nature of concepts without a Platonic admixture. And as far as values, he said openly that he did not believe ethics was a science. You could not derive values from facts. Now, these deficiencies, they're errors or ignorance that does not affect the Greek mode of thought as I. But they do leave the Greek approach vulnerable to an intellectual attack if there were a knowledgeable anti-Aristotelian philosopher around. But there weren't. There wasn't in the ancient world. Of course, there was Plato, who was way ahead of his time. But, Homer-loving Athenians regarded Plato more or less as Penn and Teller. He was, a side issue. This was not a serious, who's going to go into another dimension and leave this great world? So the Athenians had no modal enemy. So their weaknesses were not relevant to their fall. They were the first thinkers in the West. So you could not say in logic they fell because of other thinkers having better theories. They had to fall for non-intellectual reasons. And here I draw on, I'm not original in history. I draw on the standard account of the fall of classical Greece. They were destroyed by wars. First by the Peloponnesian Wars with the Spartans, and then by the permanent subjugation of Athens by the Macedonians. And after that whole thing, their city was ruined, really physically ruined, and with it, their self-confidence and their city. And historians of this period, which I'm not, say that the dominant feeling was that they were overwhelmed, they were desperate. They concluded that their whole way of approaching the world was wrong, and that's now almost everywhere described as their failure of nerve. They were just wiped out, everything was no good, and they had to look for something. Now here we see a modal fall triggered not by thinkers with a new intellectual viewpoint, but by a public more or less ignorant of philosophy, but incited by military defeat to turn over the established quo. Modal change due to war is rare. In the case of Athens, however, I don't think it's difficult to understand. I grant, and I'm not going to enumerate, that the Athenians were responsible in part because of the many, many, many mistakes that they made in their military strategy and in their democratic politics. But even leaving aside their mistakes, it's hard to imagine any other ending for a small intellectual city emerging without technology into a world which was ignorant of ideas and hostile to them, and militarily much more powerful in the end. I strongly believe that if the enemy of the Athenians hadn't been the Persians, the Spartans, and the Macedonians, then it would soon enough have been some equivalent hordes from the camps of anti and pre-philosophy. And to me, the astonishing thing is not that the Athenians fell, but that they were able to last as long as they did in the unavoidable context in which they appear. Now, when the Athenians turned for something else, they wouldn't have put it in these words, but when they rejected the I mode, they knew of only the two ends. The M2 was dominated Orient, and the Oriental cults quickly swarmed Athens and were popular within it. But the Athenians could not go for it. They simply could not accept it. It was just too alien, too anti-life, too barbaric. In other words, they were still too pagan to consider M2. So what they chose was they turned toward the divine, elevating him from Zeus to something that was the source and protector of human happiness in this world, which is what they felt now that they needed. So they turned, in effect, to the M1 mode. Nor did they think, and this is very common, nor did they think that this was revolutionary. Not always true, but in this case. To them, it was merely a change in emphasis. More looking up to God, less confidence in doing it on your own, but God was becoming the foundation, and this world, the derivative. Now, this change to M1 was possible only because the non-I tradition religion, even though relegated to the back burner, had never been fully renounced, as we saw. Neither by the public, nor even as we saw in emotional terms by most of the advanced thinkers. So we had a rival mode in waiting. It was the only alternative that was known and acceptable. And in that situation, you have a real potential threat to the ruling mode. Because if it falls, and that's what people know as an acceptable alternative, it has tremendous weight on its side. The advocates of the tradition just wait for events to discredit the current, and then they move in. So I would summarize it, this is a metaphor, the whole Greek picture as a child creates a painting of unsurpassed beauty. In judging it, his age is irrelevant. But he is a child, so one expects him sooner or later to lapse into childishness. And that's my summary of ancient Greece and the ancient I mode. Now let's jump all the way to the Enlightenment in the 18th century, which is the only other I mode. Now we know the cause of the rise of the Enlightenment, and it is one man, Isaac Newton. Of course, he was carrying on Aristotle's philosophy, but it wasn't Aristotle as understood in the 13th century that caused the Enlightenment. It was Isaac Newton, whose revolution was a thunderous blow to the medievalism of his time. And there was still medievalism in the M1 form, as we'll see, in his century. In some respects, thanks to Newton, the West grasped more clearly and consistently than the Greeks that men live in a lawful universe, wholly knowable by their unaided reason operating on the data of sense. And they grasped it essentially through Newton's astounding experiments, the laws he discovered, the predictions he could make. And Alexander Pope, in a famous couplet, expressed the astonishment which propelled the whole of Europe into a new age. Quote, she said, nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light. Now, the Enlightenment inherited the Greeks' fundamentals, but also their gaps and errors. But these modern eyes were much less concerned with philosophy than the Greeks had been. On the whole, the influential men believed that the most important intellectual discoveries had already been made and that their own task was to apply these discoveries to practical life. Now, how was the status of religion as a rival mode in waiting during the Enlightenment? Well, it was both weaker and stronger, even though that's considered the age of unbelief. It was weaker, certainly, in the sense that the traditional religion, Christianity, was not merely given a backseat, but was reviled and ridiculed. But it was stronger at that time because most of the Enlightenment eyes accepted by implication religion's real, fundamental philosophic ideas that the Greeks never had. The deists, for example, most of the founding fathers were always taken as religion was nothing. It was nothing, but they still gave it a hell of a role. They said, in effect, no, not in these words, God is retarded. He wouldn't dare touch Newton's laws. We can live our life without worrying about him. But contrary to the Greek view, he truly is omnipotent. It was he in the beginning that created the whole thing, and he still could fundamentally change and destroy it and destroy all its laws. Of course, he won't do it, but that's the power that he has. Now, the Greeks, if they heard that, would have regarded that as simply as the destruction of nature and the destruction of reason. Now, the Enlightenment didn't emphasize it, but they did not kill off God. They took the worst, most fundamental view and said, well, that was the past, but not anymore. So they didn't, in that sense, religion was stronger. It was Christianity without, Jesus, without Christ. Well, that's too strong, but you know what I mean. The ancients did not have instilled into their brain 17 centuries of Hebraic and Oriental dogma to try to expunge, as the Enlightenment did. And also, being as philosophical as they were, the Greek eyes understood the illogic of trying to combine this dogma with secularist reason. The Enlightenment eyes, by contrast, left their rival in waiting with the potential for a very much stronger comeback. Though, as it turned out, because of Kant, the potential took a back seat at this point. It stayed back. Where it went from there, we'll discuss. But the immediate movement after Kant rejected M altogether, although they didn't kill it. Now, the I mode, by contrast, after only a century or so, was repudiated by everybody. Traditional, modern, establishment, didn't make any difference. It was pushed not to a back burner, but off the stove. Now, why did the Enlightenment eye fall? It was not due to social political events. Now, there was no war, no economic crises, no popular uprising that could have been sufficient to bring down the modern I mode because it spanned continents and was unaffected by local eruptions. The trigger this time as a purely intellectual event, Kant's critical philosophy, widely and very rapidly accepted by thinkers as the definitive solution to the eternal and seemingly unanswerable problems of the ages, especially what Kant was given credit for was he made it clear what concepts are and do, and he gave us the foundation for values. So he picked on the two major gaps and showed within his system a unique way of dealing with them. Now, this was a real bombshell, and the relatively unphilosophical Enlightenment figures had no clue to an answer to it. Not only did they not offer intellectual opposition, many of them did not have any idea that Kant was an enemy of their viewpoint, and a great many classified Kant as a spokesman of the Enlightenment, a spokesman of reason. So if you're going to have a battle between thinkers at ease in dealing with broad abstractions and knowing exactly what they think and where they're going, and thinkers who don't even know they're in a battle and are more interested in action, you don't have to say, I wonder why one side lost. The Athenians in Greece didn't have to pay for their defects philosophically because there was no Kant to cash in on them. But now there was, and he did. So I would contrast the two eyes this way. I fell in the ancient world because of a panic of the populace independent of the intellectuals. In the modern world, because of a passion of the intellectuals independent of the public. You got that? There's two different ways right there. There's many ways, but there's two different ways on the eye itself. A disaffection in the intellectual world without the public, or a disaffection in the public world without the intellectual. And let me say, in both cases, the fall of the eyes was rapid, in contrast to some other mode. And in both cases, the new mode in its early stages was not seen by most people as a cultural revolution. Even when it was an intellectual cause, daily life was not overthrown instantly unless Soviet Russia came in to the United States. Then you know. But merely, there's a change in emphasis, a little change in this and that. And by the time they really see what it is, they're used to it. That's the way things are. All right, let's take a look at M1, starting with the ancient version, the Hellenistic Roman. Now I'm going to start with a really, really important point. I mean, a general rule. Within the eye periods, both of them, there is no intellectual change across time in regard to the mode's fundamentals or their interpretation by the eye cultural creators. In other words, the eye people remain modally the same and have the same interpretation. The secularism of Thales and of Aristotle is the same. It's not that Aristotle is more religious or less religious. And they interpret secularism as they have different achievements, maybe some contradictions, but the whole thing remains the same. You don't say early Greek secularism, middle where it was more religious, third where it really became, went off in the world of angels, and then back. There's nothing like that. That, by the way, is true of M2 also. And that goes right through eyes, both of them, from Aristotle to Newton to Hugo. They are all the same and the same interpretation, if you follow my presentation. You cannot have differences within the eye mode because any difference takes you out of the I mode. For instance, suppose somebody says, I'm an I, and the next person says, I am too, but I give some more importance to the supernatural. That's it. He no longer believes in the I. So it's either just a juxtaposition, or he's saying that this world derives from the supernatural. Or in regard to epistemology, he says, absolutely everything is based on experience except those 5 propositions. Well, then it's no longer then those 5 propositions. Are they just a juxtaposition? It's not an approach. No, they're the foundation. That's how we learn all the rest. So there are no modal changes, no reinterpretations within I. And we'll find the same within M2. Because they are pure modes, there's nowhere for them to go. But the case is different with a mixed mode. And we'll here just confine ourselves to M1. Because the mixed mode combines principles from 2 incompatible approaches. And therefore, it leads to a whole bunch of different incompatible guides to integration. They're incompatible, but each expresses equally the essence of the mode. It's a mixed mode, and a mixed mode cannot tell you how much to go in one way or how much to go in the other way. As long as you keep the connection, there's a huge freedom of interpretation with huge resulting differences, all of them saying, I agree with the mixture, I hold God as the fundamental, I know that there must be a priori, etc. For instance, if you're trying to combine Plato and Aristotle, you can do that in a great many ways. Keep everything, but more emphasis to Plato, closer to Plato, or more emphasis on Aristotle, closer to Aristotle. There's so much about examples of this, but I have to just give it to you as it is. I mean, as I'm able to excerpt it with the time. And just look at a few examples from Rome. You will see not only that there are all these different interpretations within the one ONE, within the one, M1 category, from one extreme to another, and you will see also that they do not arise by caprice, without logic. They always arise in a definite order. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning is what comes right after the pure predecessor, and the end is what comes right before the pure successor. And what you have in between is a moving transition, going from one side to the other. There's no equivalent of that in the eyes of the M2s at all. I don't know, we didn't cover a lot of this, but if you take just the jump from Aeneas to Epileus, which is several centuries in Roman literature, Aeneas is reverent in regard to the supernatural, but he's hesitant. He makes a brief stopover. He thinks it was great, but he wants to come back to earth. And what his party is interested in is the glory of Rome and the physical life in heaven. Now you jump to Apileus is supposed to be the father of the novel, the only writer of a novel in the whole Roman case. And it's a comedy and so on, but when he finally hits the jackpot and embraces the cult of Isis, he is ecstatic. He wants nothing but to throw off the whole world and live with God. Now, Aeneas gives no evidence that he wants to go that far. He thinks God is good, but when my time comes, I'll go there. But I want to enjoy things here. That is a big difference, and it would be more impressive to you if I gave you a whole bunch of stages, but you look it up. Although people don't present it that way, but, Or look in education. The schools started by presenting grammar and the various subjects. as a means of political success, teaching the kid oratory and eloquence so he would go out and get elected and influence people. And by the end, it was floating abstractions, study as an end in itself. A movement, you see, from the worldly to the otherworldly, from something that should be concretely applied to something that's floating as an end in itself. And there were all the stages. But in all cases, they say, of course, this world is real, and it's important, and we're going to get to it. The other one controls it, but at the beginning, okay, he controls it, but now let's go back. And at the end, he controls it, and let's stay there. And you can see the same in politics. We didn't discuss the Republic, but the Republicans evoke God regularly. Polybius praised them as being so religious as against the Greeks. And this was early, because to validate their form of politics, I won't even bother with their form of republicanism, to their idea of creating class harmony, they constantly evoke God. He was the one that justified it. But nevertheless, what God justified is a way of the rich and the poor achieving harmony here on earth. But by the time you get the empire, the justification is the emperor is God. He's deified, and it doesn't make a difference what he does practically, whether he kills the rich or kills the poor, So there was a revolution, you could say, from the Republic to the empire. But in most areas, there was no revolution at all. There was a gradual change, and I've omitted most of it, a gradual change, but always in the same direction. Early AM with a substantial element of secularism, gradually, slowly evolving into M2. Now, it's a bromide that the pagans became increasingly religious across the centuries, and that ended only when religion had become everything. That has to be the case, because it went from Athens to Christianity. The Athenians could hardly jump to the embrace of Tertullian. Something had to come in between. But I think beside that, what's generally known, there is a modal explanation for this continuing increase in religion. I think it is inherent in the M1 mode. Inherent in the M1 mode. Because the integration of M1 depends on a hierarchy, which I stressed in the handout. It depends not just that the two elements are juxtaposed. That's not an integration, that's not a mode of integration. I stress that both of these are presented as modes of integration, and it's only because of that they could be influential. The divine was the base, the worldly, the imperfect derivative. If so, whenever a person would focus on either element separately, they give incompatible advice. The Aristotelian one and the Platonist one, they have to, by their nature, give such incompatible advice. What then are people to do? Whatever their proclamation of believing in a mixture, they have to make a choice, and what can they ultimately choose but the base, which is the foundation, which is the revered, which even though it casts its light on this world, if you have to choose, you have to go to that on which everything is founded. So increasingly, the base will set the terms. It sets the context of thought and of future thought, so that the derivative is increasingly minimized and ends up being derogated. So in the end, the base wins out. Now, I don't think the ancients themselves would have experienced this progression in the terms I've just stated, but they would have done it much more concretely. But I think it's the same thing, but this is the way they would have experienced it. Initially, they adopted M1, they wouldn't use M1, but initially they adopted M1 as a practical necessity. They lost the earlier confidence, so the divine was their protector, the place to turn to when man was helpless. Well then, each new inability to cope with a problem, each new outburst of social anxiety or people seeming helplessness, and of course you can't have life without problems and decisions, what would lead the M1 communities naturally to turn ever more to God, who is the one who is to protect us from the problems of this life, and ever less to man for answers. So while they are still pursuing happiness, they're realizing more and more what they're depending on God for and what God wants of them, the duty. And pretty soon, or not pretty soon, after a while, you see that you just can't combine a life of Greek pursuit of selfish happiness and a life of divine duty. And so you have to make a choice, and by the time you decide to make a choice, the choice has been made for itself. So I want to stress this point. In and of itself, and we leave aside external factors like philosophic enemies, existential triggers. Just take the mode in control by itself. A pure mode such as I has the potential to exist unchanged indefinitely. And this is true even though both I's live for a very short time, but I've given you some reasons why. M1, by contrast, though it can drag on for centuries, has always been a mediator continually moving in the direction of a pure. So we use Marxist terms, it carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Now, the cause of its collapse in the ancient world was not popular existential convulsion, nor the sudden eruption on the scene of challenging original thinkers. There was growing public disenchantment within the pagan establishment, but there was no revolution, no decisive uprising, no bomb of counter Aristotle which wiped out everything. The M1 mode in the ancient world was not killed off by a mob, a war, or an intellectual revolution. It moved to its conclusion by the one path, the sub-one, the M1, by the fact that it was a one, namely the logic of being a modal mixture. And that, I think, is something that will be helpful in our future discussion. Now, the changeover from M1, like that of all modes, also requires triggers. In this case, existential conditions. But we're talking now mighty world-spanning Rome, so there was no single datable cause. All kinds of things have been mentioned: provincial revolts, military anarchy, barbarians, debauched emperors, proliferating Orientalism, bread and circuses. You could just go on the welfare state, but crises as such are not decisive. What is how people deal with those crises. And of course, in Rome, they had one means of dealing with such crises. And the pagan approach was failing, but the religious approach was growing, and they told us how to function. So, all of the evils, they were saying, all this Roman debauchery and immorality is coming from the fact that they aren't embracing God. And that's the only thing we know to direct our thinking and our lives. If Ayn Rand had published Atlas Shrugged at that time, at that stage of M1, even if it had been read and studied by the intellectuals, it would have been regarded as truly ridiculous, even if leaving out the parts of the Industrial Revolution that they couldn't understand. It would have been regarded not only as mistaken, but ridiculous. The whole I had already been long written on. It was dead. Now, this was where we were led, and this is what we should be given, having thrown off the I. So once that's true, all the triggers could be assessed only in terms of the operative modal base. in the modes, in the M1 mode's latest stages, was M1. So I do not believe that all those events were the cause of Rome's fall, all the standard events, although they weren't irrelevant. But they were the fuel feeding the fire. And the fire was the Romans' interpretive framework. In other words, the inexorable drive of M1 carried along to its end. Now, I'm afraid I'm actually going to have to omit the modern M1 because I've gone over long trying to make this clear. Give me, modern M1 is, you can take the Renaissance as an anticipation because that was the first expressions of secularism, and that went through the Age of Reason, 17th century. And if we worked it out, you would see, or you read my book, the modern M1 also has a variety of incompatible integrative guides, but now the situation is reversed. Plato is installed, and Aristotle in the 13th century is coming. And people are more and more attracted to Aristotle. And then the church made the fatal move of introducing Aristotle as part of them, and as part of the Catholic doctrine, and they tried to integrate the two. But as soon as they did that, it couldn't be integrated, and there was, Aquinas made the fundamental concession that Aristotle was essentially right, although he did not think that it refuted Catholicism. And then once that was so, that there was an Aristotle along with the Plato, which was still a very weakening base. And then when Newton came, that was the end, and the Platonic base, the whole M1 collapsed. So it collapsed in the modern world because of Aristotle at the start and Newton, therefore. And here you see M1 also inexorably evolving. When the church tried to first accept Aristotle, they had to go through M1. In other words, God is still the supreme in everything, but God created this world, so it's okay to study it the way Aristotle said. And then once they studied it the way Aristotle said, that became more and more important, and God started to take a back seat. And as soon as that happened, then the secular element rose. So the M1 also inexorably moved across a path, and it did it in a perfectly logical step from the time when it first closest to M2 all the way to it was atrophying and died by the time of Newton. The old M1s didn't dare speak because it was obviously true, and that was the end. It was like Descartes to Newton. So I want to go to medieval in our remaining time. That is M2 medieval. And here I just want to mention what is distinct about the fall of the modern M1. Here we see change caused by a distinctive form of competition against the establishment mode. Competition not from it. Up to now we've seen competition from a traditional mode, waiting from the past. But here we see competition from a new mode, if you look at it from the medieval point of view. Utterly unexpected, utterly unpredictable at the time. They had no remembrance at all of Aristotle, a bombshell with no historical warning, yet able to get a hearing and no popular uprising, no non-intellectual triggers, just one set of ideas against another, and he massacred. You can look at it, one more thing on M1. M1 in any era occurs when people try to combine supernaturalism and secularism. And then depending on the context, they will move up to heaven or down to earth. And either way, M1 will be the transition from one pure mode to another. So you can think of it as M1 is the mindset of a society in which Plato is going, in which Plato is coming or going. And while at the same time, Aristotle is going or coming. And then when they each get there, that's pure and static until something external. All right, now let's go to M2. The medieval M2s were philosophical, like the ancients. And there were no ideas inherent in their approach that would lead necessarily to self-destruction. They are a pure mode like I. And indeed, in this case, they weren't battered out by the I as the I were. The M2 ruled the West for 1,000 years. Now, the church did have to struggle against obstacles for centuries, but once it was enthroned, there were no more such obstacles left to precipitate a modal change. No military force could crush the whole of Christendom. There were no threatening recalcitrant monarchies. There was no well of popular outrage over church behavior. There were heresies, but they were really taken care of by the Inquisition. People were horribly poor by our standards, but that in no way incited even discontent, let alone rebellion. In part because they had no concept of how we live today. But more importantly, the leadership warned its flock against enjoying even the little that they did have. And of course, they were then being completely consistent with the philosophic fundamentals of Christianity. So far from the church promising rewards in this life, they taught that everything worth having, being spiritual, could be attained only after life. The attempt to gain pleasure from this life is a metaphysical perversion because it's based on a corrupt view of reality. So, in terms of practical economic issues, the medieval M2s were invulnerable. You could not use problems in that area to upset them. People were promised nothing. They understood that that was a virtue, that the acceptance of nothing was exactly what God wanted. So if their system produced nothing, that was its virtue. It didn't disillusion them. On the contrary, if you brought in the Industrial Revolution, they'd flip out as being, you saw that attitude all the way through the night. You see it through Bush, where science threatens religion. Well, you can imagine what it would have been like in the 13th, 12th century. You are supposed to, quote, hateth this life, and then your soul will be better off in eternity. Now, it's hard for you to believe it, but they believed it. These people were sincere. In this way, people obediently lived the unlivable, as we would call it. They did it century after century because they felt this was just an interlude on the way to true life. The M1 mentality, M1, is in effect a moderate. He's juggling two balls and he wants to get somehow the right relationship. M2s are indignant at this whole spectacle. Moderation is a sin. They have an unbreached, completely principled commitment to their view. Now, they didn't live up to it maybe themselves, nor their flocks fully. But that, in their view, was no reason to question it, because all men are imperfect anyway by the nature of the setup. You do the best you can, and you ask divine forgiveness. So here is a case which is none of the Greek or Roman triggers are applicable to the changeover from M2. We see the first modal change in Western history generated purely by means of an intellectual innovation. And of course, you know that it's Aristotle. He flabbergasted the church. They came soon to believe they can't live with him and they can't live without him. The avid anti-Aristotelians tried their best to squelch him, but they didn't have the power. And so the idea of reconciliation with Aristotle became the voice of the church. And this reliance on the Greek approach is what led the church to its downfall, as we've seen in the past. But I want you to get down the reason. It led the church to its downfall because the church was allowing a contradiction in fundamentals, in its own fundamentals. Not some derivative that it wasn't consistent about, but the very fundamentals. The supernaturalist movement was saying, let's make peace with secularism. Our movement was entirely on faith, saying, let's make peace and build into our system a movement which says faith is corrupt. Of course, they said, we're going to have it as a world derivative from God. But that amounted to, let's save M2 by turning it into M1. And once you do that, you're on the road out. So 1,000 years, then Aristotle, within the relatively short span of 200 years, which is short for that time, the Renaissance, and then very quickly, pure M1 fading fast toward M2. Now, the new cause of modal change revealed here is not simply an invasion by the enemy, a la the case of Kant, in which the establishment didn't understand or couldn't defend against. It is an invasion of which the champions of the establishment decided they cannot fight without accepting some of the fundamentals of the enemy, but by doing so, they thereby methodically contradict the essence of their own mode. Now you can make a case that they had no choice, that they could not, once Aristotle was at all widely known, have squelched it. There were too many anticipations, too much honesty, and too much sheer intellectual despair with what was going on. Maybe, you very well may, but whether they did or not, the point is they couldn't escape it, and once they did, they built that disaster into their foundation, and as they saw it, it was join with the pagans or lose. So they joined and lost. So pagan culture was no obstacle to the church at the beginning. In fact, it fed the church's growth by serving up the decadent later Romans as its product, as the only alternative to Christianity. But a millennium later, pagan thought took its revenge. All right, now let's look at M2 modern just quickly. I've already presented Marx as an idealist and a rationalist, despite his statements, and I'm not going to recapitulate that. The Marxists claim that they succeeded not because of ideas, but because of economic conditions which generated a civil war, philosophy they dismissed as an impotent, quote, superstructure, but nevertheless, they in practice regarded philosophy, at least their own ideology, as the key to their success. And in fact, as I mentioned in a previous course, they regarded their ideology as the essence of reality. And so there is a great philosophic similarity between Christianity and Marxism if we speak of fundamentals. But here is the difference. Marxism offered itself as an antidote and alternative to the tyranny of Christianity. Religion, they said, offers pie in the sky. Ridiculous. They're going to bring pie down to earth. We're going to create a world that will bring the rewards of science, including abundance, to all. Now, the worldly utopia, the communists stated as their goal was just the world, which was the attempt for that, was just what the medievals equated with the worst sin. That's the greatest difference between the two versions. Note, both made fundamental concessions to the philosophic enemy. Because as I've shown, Marxism presents itself as secularism and empirical science, and is in fact idealism and thoroughly rationalist, and in that way otherworldly. I mean, anybody who takes over Hegel's dialectic process and deduces everything from it and then says, I got it from experience. But the difference is this. So modern M2 also swallowed a major contradiction. But the medievals didn't do it century after century after century. They didn't do it except when it seemed an unavoidable means of self-defense against a destroyer they didn't know what else to do with. The moderns took hold of those concepts, secularism, empiricism, from the outset as the essence of their approach. They were preaching throughout a secular, worldly philosophy while believing in idealism and rationalism and having that direct their course. So that is a much, much, much greater fundamental self-contradiction than just the tail-end polemics of the church. Now we know that the modern M2s got the very opposite of their utopia. Many, many valid reasons have been given for this, which I'm sure you know. I say, in a word, you can ask for elaboration, that they failed. At least part of the reason was their modal contradiction. Since their minds and hearts were in their supernaturalist dismissal of this world, it'd be impossible for them to preside over or deliver a demanding worldly promise, which they didn't think that important anyway. These men, the dictators and the leaders, in their own eyes were validated by their immersion in a realm of M2 ideology. They felt, and you saw this in the news when Khrushchev was on TV, their stature, their grandeur was conferred on them because history had brought them forth as the spokesman of the dialectic triumph. So their supremacy in the world of floating abstractions is their key to glory. Their rule over the lesser people in that world. The rest are the riffraff, like the people in Plato's cave, you know, and that could not give them the mind. They wanted industrialization to compete only with the West, but not because they wanted an industrial wealthy society, and they couldn't have any more than the popes could have. To create an industrial society, you have to be all concerned with concretes. How do I make steel here, with this machine, and so on? That isn't in the world of the, the dialectic process and all the rest of that. In effect, if they were to have been able to do that, it would be like a Platonist traveling up the divided line, finally basking in the a priori light of perfect reality, which they believed they had. And then, filled with truth, come back down to the cave and start building a society of heavy industry and consumer satiation. It can happen. Modally, it can happen. And if you go into the actual facts, which I'm not going to give you, read Hannah Arendt, among many others. She shows how methodically these regimes, Nazi and communist, engaged in economic self-sabotage, even to the point of doing things that they knew would be harmful to the war effort in order to advance the ideology. Because to them, no matter what they said, the ideology was more important, which is what it would be if you're a Platonist. But all those facts, which make fabulous reading, take time. No Western regime before communism had ever promised men, millions of men, a perfect earthly utopia at the price of merely short-run misery, and then failed so spectacularly to achieve it. The problem becoming even worse because they found out that the despised capitalist nations, and only them, seemed to have everything desirable, including the pie. The analogy, if you want to understand the fall of communism, is like this. Imagine, go back to the medieval era, just an analogy. The flocks of the Pope had somehow got to learn that God was sending thunderbolts of hellfire to kill the saints while showering love on Satan. Now, that would really raise havoc with the medieval world. Of course, medievals don't have to worry about that because you don't find that out until after you're dead. But the communists see it every day, generation after generation. So I would say Hitler was defeated by the West in war, but Soviet Russia was not. Was not. On the contrary, the West was Soviet Russia's greatest ally. I don't care what treaty, whoever signed. Communism collapsed because of internal factors which not even the modern technology of repression could eradicate. And here it was everyone. The intellectuals, the public, even the dictator Gorbachev came to see the dogma it has failed. We can't get anywhere. Nobody believed it, and it just died. So the cause of that fall is not rebellion. It's not the evolution of a mixed mode. It's not any new philosophy that came into Russia. And it's not any of the typical non-intellectual triggers, such as political corruption or starvation, which were there and everybody knew they were there from the beginning. The cause is what I would call a modal deficiency. In other words, in this case, even though M2 in itself is stable, it can't survive if its own exponents explicitly misidentify its fundamentals. You cannot be a success in any mode if you're propagating and making promises and creating societies which everybody expects to be the different one. So I make a big difference, therefore, that I say the fatal effect on a mode's longevity of philosophic deficiency, whether that deficiency is just they don't know philosophy, they're helpless, or they contradict themselves. But the contradiction in the form of these modern secular M2s is much grosser than in any other modal fall. And I think the fall of these two so fast, communism, fascism, has led, or is one of the reasons that's led to an almost unanimous dismissal in the West of both communism and fascism as viable possibilities. I would look at it this way. If there are to be successful totalitarians in our time, judging from history, I think they would have to stay away from the secular, worldly promises. So far, science, economics, biology, whichever they choose, and however they distort and reinterpret it, has never been able to do the job that they need. If you promise heaven on earth, you get knocked out of contention fast. But promising heaven, that's a different story. Now, I had wanted to give you, can you stand just giving up the question for me? Yes, no, yes by a show of hands. I just wanted a few tail-end things, which the later lectures are short. I just want a few further observations, surveying not the individual constituents, but the whole overall picture. So get the chart. I want you to take a temporal overview, time, and look at the difference in pace in the rate of modal change between the pre-modern and the modern world. The pre-modern world, for the most part, is marked by prolonged modal tenure and leisurely changeover. The modern, by rapid, dramatic swings. The early, across a span of 19 years, from Thales to Christianity, adopted 3 of the modes, an average out of about 5, what is that? How many years is that? I lost that page. 19 years, 3, so what's 3 and 80? About 600 or more years averaged out. Whereas the latter, we have only 1,400 years as against 1,900. Oh, here, I'll put it in the next one. Has adopted all 5 in 1,400, in 400. So here it is now. The pre-modern average lifespan of a mode was 600 plus. And if you omit the brief I period, it's 800 plus. By contrast, in the modern world, and even if we include the Renaissance, the average modal lifespan, which has been more or less the same for the 3 dim categories, has been 200. So the change is really, really rapid, relatively speaking, which is another factor you want to take into account in looking at the world today. Now, why this difference in pace? One reason frequently offered is modern technology, if not the internet publishing, et cetera, et cetera. That plays a role. I don't think that's by any means the main or significant factor, because other things being equal, all ideologies have equal access to modern media. So it might play a role in how fast they can take over, but it has nothing to do with who wins. I think there is a more important reason why modes change in the modern world. You see, they changed as fast from the Renaissance without the internet or even with modern education and so on, as they changed now. I put it to you this way: this is my idea. You can take it or leave it. There is a huge difference between the pagans and the moderns in the view of philosophy. Now, I quickly say here, I do not refer to the content, to their views, to their ideas, to the different answers they give, this world or another world. No. I'm talking about the different reasons for regarding philosophy itself as important, as of value, as worth having positions on. A very, very different viewpoint in the ancient and the modern world. Now take Aristotle. He's typical. Treasured philosophy as the highest form of intellectual contemplation and intellectual self-development. But that for him, and for the whole pagan world, was an end in itself. He pursued broad abstractions. He was only interested in is this view true? The idea of what practical difference will this make in men's life or the future culture, etc., is just not a factor in the ancient or Roman world. Because these people are pioneers. They could hardly grasp the effects of philosophy on life until those effects were visible in history on a long enough basis that they could abstract them and say, these ideas are not just fascinating, they actually change lives and cultures. But of course, they didn't know anything of what's to come. So I would say the pagans were the most philosophical. They were certainly guided by philosophy, but you would not expect the appearance of a new philosophy, however revolutionary, to make them say, okay, our whole way of life has to be thrown over, because to them, the connection between philosophy and their way of life was not seen. So they weren't suitable for intellectual takeover. Now, the Christians, by contrast, were the very first Westerners to grasp that philosophy was not only of theoretical interest, but was also a power in the world. A power on which their earthly rise and triumph depends. So unchristian philosophy was not just false. It was an assault on value, on them, and therefore on God. It was a practical evil, which would lead to disaster. Well, then, the moderns, once the Christians faded away, saw the development of culture. They saw that disaster, the waning of religion and the rise of science, actually begin to unfold. They saw a continuing clash between reason and science, religion and science, which did not and could not have existed in the ancient world, that didn't have much science and had a religion that they could set aside. But now, in the modern world, they had enough knowledge to see a real clash, and this is two different philosophies, and where one came from, and where the other is leading, and how impossible it is to put them together. Now it became a battle that it's urgent to get your philosophy in, because the other is going to be disaster. No, there's no pagan precedent to that, but the moderns, one way or the other, grasped what Bacon said: knowledge is power, but they applied it for the first time since Christianity, to philosophy. And that statement of Bacon is correctly taken as the first definition, essential definition of the modern mind. Now, this is why the triggers of the ancient modal change, even though they presuppose a philosophic context, were never new ideas, never intellectual system. There was no one after Athens fell, like Aristotle, Newton, Kant, to come and smash and change everybody. They weren't open to. They would hear Kant or whatever and say, very interesting, next, and go on. But the post-pagan triggers, if you look, have always been intellectual, have always been the reaction of intellectuals to new abstract ideas that were at first unknown to the public. So we have the paradox that the Greeks were 100 times more philosophical than later, but they weren't changed by philosophy as such. And the moderns are much less philosophical and much more susceptible and feel they got to get their viewpoint insofar as they have it. Now, by today, I would just say, for accuracy. Most of the moderns have lost this respect for philosophy. But for about 600 years, they did have it. Thank you very much.